Hello and welcome to Pop Screen, part of the Geek Show podcast network. We are the Geek Show's show dedicated to movies either starring, by, or about pop stars. No, the podcast covers such a broad range of musical and cinematic genres, from documentaries to science fiction, from country and western to hip-hop. I'm your host, Graham Williamson. I'm a filmmaker and critic for The Geek Show and Horrified magazine, the British horror website. I've been joined this week by...
Aidan Fatkin, yet again. I also contribute to The Geek Show. You can find me on Letterboxd under the username Aidan F. I'm starting to get my mojo back for watching films, by the way, now. It's finally happened. It's taken a year thanks to the fucking pandemic, but we've got there. We finally got there. So
that's the weird thing, isn't it? Over the last year, when we've had all the time in the world to watch films, I've been less inclined to watch films. I'm pretty sure there's an episode of The Twilight Zone that's based around this premise.
It does feel like we've been in a Twilight Zone episode for the last year or so, mind.
Yeah.
So, I completely agree.
Yes. The fact, listeners, that this week's episode of Pop Screen is a heart-wrenching documentary about a mercurial talent who died before her 30th birthday on its own says nothing about this show other than, hey, it's not going to be an ABBA musical every week. But Asif Kapadia Amy, about the all-too-brief life and career of Amy Winehouse, is of a piece with one of this show's major running themes, to use pop music as a lens to examine particular social and generational trends, in this case particularly the way that celebrities are packaged for our entertainment. The film was released in 2015 at Cannes. It went on to win the Best Documentary Feature Oscar, and now, 10 years after the death of its subject, we reconvene to ask if Kapadia's film has aged better than the culture it depicts. Now, I think maybe an interesting way of starting this would be to go straight into how we feel about the artist.
Am I starting then? Or...
Well, I know that you had a slightly different journey to me. I'll just fill mine in first, because I always loved Amy Winehouse. I loved Amy Winehouse from the moment I heard Stronger Than Me on the radio. And I distinctly remember thinking, wow, this gives me the same feeling I had when I first heard Lauryn Hill's solo work. And then she made an album, Frank, which I thought was great. And she disappeared for what felt like a very long time. Occasionally you saw pictures of her, and it's hard to really sort of think back to this, because that sort of rail thin tattooed big beehive with the streak in it, that is just what people think of when they think about Amy Winehouse. But when that was first unveiled, I thought, oh shit, what, is she okay? You know, because she did dramatically thinner than she did. But then she puts out Rehab, which is terrific. Back to Black comes out. She becomes, I would say, probably the biggest female singer in the UK. I mean, it was a time slightly before the likes of Adele came along, and Adele came along very much in her wake. And then she gets trapped in this weird vortex of tabloid stories about her drinking and drug use, which we'll talk about later because it forms a large part of Kapadia's documentary. Now, for you, that wasn't the case, was it? That wasn't your history with Amy?
Now, Amy Winehouse was interesting because obviously when Graham pitched this, that I'd like to do an episode on Amy Winehouse, I felt like it was probably something about time that I bit the bullet with her. Because now with Amy Winehouse, for me in particular, all I remember, because around about the time she was famous, I would have been at least 10 years old at the time. Because when Back to Back came out, was it 2006? I've got that right. Yeah. I would have been only 10 years old, so my only memories of her would be that tabloid imagery at the time. And of course, when she tragically passed away, I was about 15. So my memories of her at the time was obviously, look at that drug addict on the TV.
Yeah.
So, and that's how, and that was just, and obviously I'm not being that to be crude or anything. That's just obviously our generation's memory of her at the time, for me in particular. So, it wasn't until like, I would have said like a couple of years after she'd sadly passed away that I felt more obliged to check her out as an artist. And I've just recently listened to Back to Black for the first time. Bloody hell, that's a depressing record, but it's a great record.
Yes, yeah. And the funny thing, I suppose part of why I was drawn towards it is that now we are sort of saturated in sort of quite dark music. I mean, people dismissively refer to sad pop girls for stuff like, Lorde and Billie Eilish and Lana Del Rey. Back then, there wasn't really anything like that coming out. And I felt like part of the reason why I latched on to Back to Black was at the time, I was on the dole. I had recently graduated university. I had a horrible time at university. And yet you were still in this kind of very blary media cycle where we were told that everything was great. And in fact, there was no such thing as class or poverty anymore. And even though Back to Black is obviously not about that, it did feel liberating that at least there was one massive pop cultural thing that didn't seem obliged to pretend that everything was happy and everything was okay.
Yeah, part of that Tony Blair zeitgeist of the time. Yeah,
it was very shiny, the Blair years. I remember thinking, well, that's when I think back to them and I try and think of a word to encapsulate it. It was just shiny. Everything had to be shiny.
And it's just gradually gotten more shit as we've gone along the years.
Yes. I mean, like I say, I thought it was a dreadful time to be young back in 2006. I didn't know I was fucking born.
Anyway, back on topic.
Yeah.
I mean, so I was quite surprised with Back to Black initially, because the first time I listened to it, I liked it. I still wouldn't call myself an Amy Winehouse fan, but I can sort of see with her lyrics and how directed they can be, and especially for a female artist to write a breakup album like the way she did, to point much of the blame on herself as she did, obviously, the relationship as well, of how that broke apart. When you listen to something like the title track, Back to Black, you can certainly get a sense of that. And I can't really think of many female artists who do that. I mean, the only other example off the top of my head who's equally brilliant at doing that is someone like Fiona Apple, for example.
Oh, right. Yeah. I was thinking, I thought what I thought you were going to say there, because she does mention it in the documentary. She says she's a big Carole King fan. And I do think there is a part of Back to Black where, it's like tapestry for the 21st century.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't listened to much Carole King, so I can't comment, but specifically Fiona Apple, I think not her last record, Fetch the Bolt Cutters, but I think it was the record before that, Idler Wheel or something like that.
Right.
Which is very similar. And I'm a massive Fiona Apple fan if you haven't checked her out. She's honestly brilliant at what she does. But no, back on point, it's just those honesty with that you find it that I find that I really appreciate on my second listen to Back to Black. And especially when you get lyrics that obviously are tampering into like the areas of the time. So artists like the Ronettes or artists like that. But it's much different here, much different context, because obviously, as Graham said, a part of Amy Winehouse's imagery is we remember her for the massive beehive, the tattoos, and obviously being a lot more, especially with the slangs confirmed. Like I think it's like on I think the first opening line on Back to Black where it's just like, I get his dick wet or something like that, and then it
kept his dick wet. Yeah,
it kept his dick wet. Yeah. So the slang is a lot more vulgar and in your face about it, and you can understand why that would turn some people off. But at the same time, you kind of got to think, well, she does have her mind on full throttle mode, really.
Yeah, there's a directness to it. Yeah. When you talked about slang, I was reminded that her most intensely London moment in this film is when she's asked about the influences on Back to Black, and she says, "I've been listening to a lot of gal groups." groups that are gals, I guess.
Gals.
It's not even that, it's gel, it's G-L, like gel. It's such a great sort of old-fashioned East End pronunciation. I loved it.
The Cockney accent is just so heart on mind. It just makes a character. Yeah.
So in terms of character, you're introduced to this with what I think is, in Capaldi's film, one of the great documentary opening scenes, the home video of her at 14 singing Happy Birthday to You to a friend. Which is wonderful, because if you haven't seen it, they're singing Happy Birthday as a kind of a joke. They're at a birthday party, no one's being that serious, but her voice is like a tornado, like even when she's joking around.
And the funny thing is that you're not expecting it in the slightest, because most singers at that time, or you presume at that age, would be just developing their voice or something like that. I mean, but for Amy to just come on just immediately with that voice just sets the tone right away. I mean, I was watching a few interviews with Capaldi as research, and throughout the footage, he explains that he's kind of Amy's like obviously looking directly into camera all the time, so it's almost in these earlier stages that she's treating the camera as her friend.
Yeah.
Regardless, so she's always looking towards the camera. She's always like looking towards it, and then of course, as it goes, further and further into the film, that relationship changes as her image changes, as her character changes. So it definitely does signal that very early on, and you're completely right. That opening scene is just a really lovely way to set it off, especially as this film gets into its darker moments. Yeah.
So we should talk a bit about Capaldi's style for people who aren't familiar with him. Capaldi has made fiction films. His film The Warrior, starring the late Irfan Khan, was I remember kind of a cause célèbre in the early noughties, because Britain was going to put it forward for a Best Foreign Language Feature Oscar. I know it's not called Best Foreign Language Feature. They change the name every year, and now it's called Best Film with them little words at the bottom or something like that. But that one, and they couldn't do it because it's set in India and the language was deemed to be not indigenous to Britain. I think they changed the rules after that because people were kind of annoyed by that. You think, well, you didn't say that bit up front. It's a film. It's not in the English language. That is kind of what the category is for.
Yeah. Which kind of explains why they make a mess of that character further on down the line.
Yes, every single, yeah. Yeah. But he has, particularly recently, had most of his success in documentaries. He's made a trilogy of documentaries about, people who I guess were pushed onto the stage at a very young age.
Yeah. As he dubs it, I think child geniuses or something, because you got Art and Senna, which obviously landed him a lot of major success. You have this one, Amy, and you have his most recent film, Diego Maradona. Now, out of the films that I've seen from Capaldi, Amy's the first one, and I've seen half an hour of Diego Maradona. And the reason why I didn't finish it at the time was not because I didn't enjoy the film or anything. It was just because I was having a lot less time on my hands at the time. So I will go back and finish it when I can. But I think what I'm drawn to Capaldi's style is like most documentarians focus on like the typical style, which is like talking heads, imagery, etc., B-roll over the top, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
With Capaldi, it's more like a montage, isn't it? Or like a collage of different imagery over the top, and you still have interviews in them, but they're more like, especially in Amy's case, they're more like distant voices, as if they're remembering Amy just as much as we are, the audience.
Yeah.
So, and that works favorably what he's trying to make across in this film. Yeah.
I think it works particularly well here. I should say I've seen a bit of Senna, and I know for some people it's the best of these documentaries, and I know a lot of people say, oh, you don't have to be into Formula One to enjoy it. I'm sure that's true, but I also think people are underestimating how little I like Formula One. It's like, God, challenge me to enjoy this. I will, I will not pass the test.
Fair enough.
I've seen the full Maradona film, which I think is good. I have some reservations about it, which I think we'll get into, because my problems with it contrast quite nicely with what I love about Amy. One thing that I think Amy has on its side that the two sports films don't is that this is an intensely documented life. That
Mm.
when you talk about someone like Diego Maradona, you're talking about someone who grew up in a different generation, from a much poorer background. His family did not have a video camera on all the time. But
Yeah,
also when
yeah.
he was at the peak of his powers, he wasn't in this culture where everyone has a camera on their phone, where there's a massive market for photographs of celebrities. That means that there is firstly a richer source of material with Amy. You get a much
Mm.
wider variety of images that makes the film more visually exciting, but also you are aware of the different ways that Amy Winehouse was looked at through her life. You are aware that whereas that early home video footage of her singing at a friend's birthday party and the shots of her walking down the street with blood coming out of her feet, they are both candid shots. They are both shots of her off stage and off her guard, but other than that, they are very different images taken by different people for incredibly different reasons.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, especially in Maradona's case, because I remember getting through like the first half an hour of it thinking, okay, this is good, but it's
Mm,
not making me latch onto it even further than it already is. And I don't know whether that's because of just my lack of knowledge in the subject, probably the
mm.
same way that I would feel about the cinema documentary. But like I said, I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just something that I'm probably going to need to sink into a bit more. But as for this, I mean, Amy Winehouse was a figure that I do remember. And there is a story. I mean, as Capadia describes it in his documentary, I think it's Film and Fall interview, not his documentary, sorry, is that with Amy Winehouse, everything was either like at the top of its peak,
Mm.
or it was incredibly dark and depressing. There was no in between. There was no part of her life that felt mediocre.
Yeah.
So in a way, that just makes it, naturally flow like a story in that regard.
Yeah, you can see a bit of it in the Maradona documentary as well, which is also, a story of an incredible rise and fall. The thing that I think Capadia does in Amy that I wish he had done more of in Maradona is that in Diego Maradona, we are constantly told that this guy was a footballer of genius, that people who'd followed the game for decades were astonished watching what he did. But as someone who isn't interested in football, I never got a real understanding of why. I never felt like I understood
Yeah.
what set him apart from other footballers. Whereas I think in
Hmm.
Amy, he gets some distance inside the subject's actual craft and makes you understand why people were surprised and impressed by her.
And I think that's a difficult thing to do because, especially when footballing is, well, footballing, you can kind
Mm.
of understand, well, hang on, I mean, he's kicking the ball about like any other footballer. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
you kind of do get that sense. Whereas with Amy Winehouse, we can hear what she sings,
Mm.
we know
Yeah.
what she sounds like, and we know about her character as well, and we know how much of a detailed, poignant lyricist she can be as well.
Mm.
So, and with all this evidence just backing it up, you can tell immediately that this comes out incredibly well detailed, well researched, and just really just loving towards its subject. Yeah, very
Yeah.
caring, I find.
Because Capadia himself, in one of the interviews I heard with him, Capadia himself was by no means an expert on Amy Winehouse's career when this documentary was pitched to him. It was pitched to him by, I think, Universal Music UK pitched it to him because they'd seen Senna and thought that he could do something similar with this. And I remember him saying that he had, for example, absolutely no idea that she played guitar. That I did because that was a part of her image when she did Frank, but for Back to Black, it wasn't part of the image and it just faded away from coverage of her. So I think in the film you can see Capaldi's kind of novice enthusiasm, that he is looking through lyrics and sort of song sheets and saying, hey, this is actually really good, and putting it up there with the enthusiasm of someone who's discovering the music for the first time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you get that sense of it as well when watching the film, I guess, because there's countless recounts of how the real Amy, you didn't know the real Amy until you seen the Frank side of her. Because that was the real Amy. As soon as she got to the back to black phase, where she had the beehive, the tattoos, she looked an awfully lot fit and a lot more sick. You do get the sense that obviously the old Amy is still there. It's just slightly clouded.
Yeah.
Within this persona that she's created, and unfortunately, that had its consequences of its own. Yeah.
Do you think the persona negatively affected her? Do you think that there became an element where she had to be that kind of tragic beehived singer or whatever, like 3-word description people cooked up?
It's a difficult one to describe because obviously when the paparazzi are concerned, and we'll get onto the paparazzi sequence is in this film later on, because honestly, they're probably some of the most overwhelming sequences of its kind that I've seen for a film to depict, never mind just a documentary. But with Amy Winehouse, I think it was hard to difficultly tell her that she wasn't a tabloid celebrity like in the vein of Katie Price or someone like that. I think that's the issue. And I think that's the misunderstanding that a lot of people misremember her by, because she wasn't like that at all. She was just someone who, had a unique talent, a unique gift. And unfortunately, when obviously, because she also suffered from bulimia as well from a very early age as well, which is an eating disorder, that impacted her, and all the bad luck that came with that. Unfortunately, that attracted the wrong crowd at the wrong time, and then she just ends up being in this mess. Yeah, it's just an awful sequence that I just can't really imagine that someone going through. It must be a horrendous situation.
I'm glad you sort of mentioned Katie Price and that kind of tabloid era, because I distinctly remember part of the oddness of this era for me was that I was watching someone who I had followed since her very first single and I knew was an incredible songwriter and an incredible vocalist, get sort of lazily dismissed as just one of those famous for being famous people. And I thought that's interesting, because the people who were saying that were people who were complaining about tabloid culture and celebrity culture. But if you thought of Amy Winehouse as being in the same bracket as Katie Price or Paris Hilton or someone like that, the only reason why you would think that is because the tabloids had told you that. That was how she was depicted in the tabloids. So there seemed to be this attitude in the 2000s that making fun of celebrities was some sort of a bold broadside against the shallowness of the mass media. And a lot of the time it wasn't. A lot of the time it was just an excuse by supposedly like liberal-minded people to just pile on young women with a drug problem.
Yeah, and Asif Kapadia does touch on this because I think there's a particular montage in the middle where obviously we do get to see that side, and we see comedians making cheap jokes about her appearance. So people like Frankie Boyle and Jay Leno is the other one, I think.
Jay Leno and Graham Norton does it as well. Yeah,
and Frankie Boyle, and you just think that as part of that zeitgeist, I mean, they still kind of do it now as part of their routines, but unfortunately, that can be read the wrong way, especially when, on the benefit of hindsight, when looking at it now. Jesus Christ, that is incredibly poorly timed when looking at those jokes now. Yeah.
And also, the part of the brilliance of that sequence is that Kapadia intercuts it with candid shots from Amy's flat, and it's when she's at the absolute depths of a heroin addiction, and she looks absolutely terrifying, so unhealthy, and you cut from that to sort of Jay Leno making a cheap joke about her cooking crystal meth or something similarly well researched. And it does, I suppose part of what the film is doing is showing you the rest of the iceberg. It's like there were a lot of things in here that I remember being in the papers, or I remember being in the music press, or seeing on TV. But it all has a different effect when it's threaded through as a story about someone's entire life.
Yeah. I mean, that sequence was one of the sequences where I had to think to myself, this isn't just a typical standard like music documentary. This has like a real bite to it and a real point to say about celebrity image, for example, or artist image, if you want to describe Amy Winehouse like that. Yeah. But no, I think it's very pointedly told from that point perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was one of the sequences that got a lot of attention when it came out, because I think in an insane way, I don't think anyone has really thought about it before. It feels like a very different environment now, this is not the first time we brought this up on Pop Screen, but it is one of the big pop music themed stories of 2021. But we're recording this against the backdrop of the Britney Spears conservatorship hearings.
Yeah.
And I remember Britney Spears' nervous breakdown was treated in a very, very similar way, because she was felt to be a very glib, silly kind of pop star. Then she did not deserve our respect when she was going through some sort of horrifying mental health crisis.
Yeah, that breakdown was utterly horrifying.
Yeah.
Because we all remember the imagery, the tabloid images of like her hair completely shaven off and having a complete breakdown in the middle of, was it like the middle of the street or something like that?
Yeah, I think she like attacked someone's car or something like that, and it was all. It's telling that I can't properly remember the context, but I have the pictures in my mind's eye.
And unfortunately, that's kind of the point that Capadia wants to bring up. A point when it comes to press and paparazzi is that you, even if you like click on the image on a website, you're still feeding that machine to keep going. And for every click you do, you're just going to make it problem get worse and worse and worse. And I'll be honest with you, like a lot of people, I fucking hate the tabloid culture in this country. I hate it, especially when it comes to like how a completely different person from Amy Winehouse, like Princess Diana, is being treated, or Meghan Markle is being treated right now. I just think it's shocking and disgusting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there is actually a bit in it which is quite prescient, where I think it's a first manager, I think it's Nick Szymanski, says that they took her for an intervention. They tried to get through to her that, she was on this very self-destructive path. And when they got to this supposedly secret location, they were surrounded by paparazzi. And he said there was absolutely no way that they could have known that without phone hacking. And sure enough, the year Amy Winehouse died, 2011, was the same year that the Leveson inquiry started up. So,
oh yeah, with News of the World. Yeah,
yes.
I remember that. I remember that distinctly. Yeah.
So it all feeds into this portrait of an industry that is corrupt, obviously, and is actively destroying people as a kind of sport.
Yeah, because Capadia mentions in the Q&A that he actually talked to reporters and the paparazzi after Amy Winehouse's death, and obviously they just felt absolutely awful for feeding into that lifestyle, because they didn't have any idea of her mental health struggles at the time. They just wanted it, obviously, just to get the job done and just feed into it. But now, after Amy Winehouse's death, they just feel absolutely awful that they contributed to it.
Yeah,
and so they should, I think.
Yeah. So let's double back a bit. Let's talk about the moment where she sort of steps up a level, because the Frank stuff is there and it's covered. And I liked that Capadia is clearly enamored of songs like What Is It About Men and I Heard Love Is Blind enough to play them at length. So the side of me that really loves Frank was I enjoyed that. There's an interview with her from around the time where she talks about being at best 80% happy with that album, and she says that someone put like fake strings on Take the Box, which she thinks sound terrible. I went to the credits. I tried to look this up because she is like really vociferous, and she says that it's not just an artistic thing. I personally hate this guy for doing that. So I'm looking at the credits for Frank and I'm thinking, I'm looking for someone who only worked on like one or two tracks. One of them has to be Take the Box and sounds like an absolute twat. And apologies if this person is innocent, but there is one guy on Frank who gets a production credit on one track only. and it is Take the Box, and his name is Johnny Rockstar. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely the guy, but
Johnny Rockstar, are you joking? It's like he's taken like Johnny Rotten's name and just like, oh, how can I tamper with this a bit?
You know what? As a rock star, I like to live the rock and roll lifestyle. Swig of Jack Daniels, a toot of cocaine, and then add some tasteful synth strings to a ballad about infidelity. That's just me being a rock star, I guess.
Is that Blake Fielder?
Okay, let's talk Blake Fielder. We've got to talk Blake Fielder now.
Now we've got to talk about Blake Fielder now, because I feel because he's a big part of how Amy became who we remember her by.
He is, yeah. Blake Fielder is the guy she married. I think she started dating him in between albums when he was with another woman. And a large part of what Back to Black is about is that moment where she was like deeply in love with him and he decided that he was going back to his wife. But that changed afterwards. He married her. He ended up in jail for grievous bodily harm. And she started seeing someone else, and they introduced her. When he got out, he introduced her to heroin, and it was just like the most dysfunctional relationship you can think of. Everything was there: the infidelity, the drugs, the violence, every ingredient for a really toxic relationship.
Yeah, back onto the Sex Pistol point. It's a bit like
Sid and Nancy.
Sid and Nancy, yeah. Very much like that. Very, really similar, actually.
It is quite weird for me as a big Sex Pistols fan when occasionally you will hear a song like that Crazy Town song that was out when I was doing my A-levels, which has a line like, "Oh girl, me and you were like Sid and Nancy," and you think that is not a comparison you want to invite.
No, it definitely isn't. Jesus Christ. You're messed up, man.
People used to talk about that like it was, I suppose it's equally fucked up to talk about Romeo and Juliet that way. It's like, oh, me and her were like Romeo and Juliet in that we were both underage and we killed ourselves. But
over a misunderstanding as well.
Over a letter that didn't deliver. Yeah, what the hell?
Thanks, Shakespeare. Anyway, but no, I mean, Blake Fielder has always been a character who, I mean, firstly, you can tell he's like, not necessarily, would you call him a scumbag or something like that? I mean,
yeah, I'd go for scumbag. I think scumbag's made for him, yeah.
Yeah, and he's the scuzziest person. And you look at Amy Winehouse, like, before she ended up the way she did, and it's just like, here you have a bright, bonny girl who has, like, the whole future laid out in front of her, meeting up with this demon or something.
Yes.
I don't know. Who's Blake Fielder? He looks like a complete arse, let's be honest. And it just disravels simply after that. Yeah.
He is weirdly cocksure too for someone who has absolutely nothing going for himself. It's like there's a bit when we are on the real downward spiral, and he is being interviewed for some sort of TV documentary or something like that.
Yeah. We do get glimpses of that interview. Yeah,
and it's when they've separated, and he says something like, "Yeah, I'm well rid of her, really. I'm a handsome guy. I go to the gym," and it's like, all right, I am prepared to believe you've been to a gym, and that's being charitable. The rest of it is active fucking self-delusion.
Yeah. It's not a character who you believe a single word of truth from.
So he's one of the villains of this documentary, and I think when it came out, everyone was expecting that any Amy Winehouse documentary is going to go very, very hard on Blake Fielder because he's just a villain. He is someone with no friends left to fight his corner. The other person who was very outspokenly against this film when it came out, and I think is a bit more complex, is Mitchell, her father. Yeah.
And it's interesting because Mitch Winehouse, who, especially how he's presented in this film, because he takes like very similar stance when it comes as Blake Fielder, because
Yeah.
at one point, I think when Amy Winehouse is on recluse mode from the paparazzi and the press just to get away from her, I think it's in St. Lucia or something like that.
Yes, it
Yeah,
is.
it is St.
Yeah.
Lucia. He invites a camera crew round to do like this documentary on what is it again? It's like for MTV or something. It's like to find her
I think
discovering the real Amy. Yeah.
What it seems to have been pitched as, and you're right, it is hard to work it out from the film. It seems to have been pitched as a documentary about being Amy Winehouse's dad, but there is that fantastic telling bit of footage that they use where he's like sat in this deck chair on a tropical island holding forth, and the cameraman just sort of pans and zooms a bit to get to this tiny image of Amy standing in the distance behind him. And you think for him, as with Blake, part of their problem was that they could never accept that their main value to the wider world is that they are connected to Amy Winehouse, that they were not intrinsically interesting as people. They were interesting because of this person they were tied to.
Yeah, I mean, there's another similar bit in the St. Lucia sequence where Amy Winehouse is forced to sign autographs by two fans by her father.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, she probably could have done that anyway in the right circumstances because we've seen her personality anywhere.
Yeah.
But for her to be dragged into signing these autographs when obviously her mental capacity was completely run down, completely worn out. Obviously, as you were saying, like fighting bulimia, fighting drug addiction, everything like that.
Yeah.
And then obviously she comes off as quite rude towards this couple initially, but obviously once you know the out context of a character at the time, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then we get to that sequence a bit later, and then Mitch is very confrontational, and it's amazing that it's still on tape because obviously the cameraman points down when they're having like this family argument in the middle of St. Lucia, in the middle of this Canary Island, and it just is really showing about that family relationship on that particular sequence, and it's a very, I think, really deep moment that really gets to that relationship at a time when you're not expecting it.
Yeah, I think that bit in Santa Lucia really shows Mitch in a very bad light. Despite that, I don't think I think he said something at the time that he'd cooperated with the film when it was being made, but he saw a rough edit and he said, "I realised that I was the villain of it." And I mean, I don't think he is, if only because Blake is there, but I also find it hard to be fully condemnatory of Mitch Winehouse because he's somebody who made a lot of mistakes, like not being around for his daughter when she was growing up, and now she's dead, and I can't imagine like having that on my conscience, really. I certainly didn't think that he was the villain in this movie.
I mean, if you look at I think the real villain of this is the media.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
If you ask me, if you had to ask me one quick question, it is the media in this story because the way they treated Amy Winehouse was absolutely abhorrent. It should never have happened in the first place. And look where we are now. I mean, it's proven time and time again that this imagery is just an abusive cycle over and over again. It'll just find the next Amy Winehouse or the next Meghan Markle to pick on. It's horrific. Yeah.
And I think that you can see it obviously in the tabloid culture and you can see it in the paparazzi stuff, and that stuff is lower than low, but you see it even in some of the quote unquote educated stuff. Like there are music awards where people make jokes about her like being drunk and waking up late, and there's that awful bit where she gets sent to do a photo shoot with Terry Richardson, who has a prolific career in both photography and accusations of rape against him. And they do this photo shoot, which is basically sort of glamorizing her self-harm habit. And you think, did anyone take a step back and think, is this a good idea? Is this what we want to be putting out there? Is this helping anyone?
Yeah. I mean, especially that earlier sequence that you mentioned, because I remember it's like the front. I think in the pre-run to the Grammys or something like that. I can't
Yeah,
exactly
yeah.
remember the context that it is, but you see all these famous musicians behind them, like Dave Grohl and Taylor Hawkins from the Foo Fighters as well, are there
That's
standing right behind them.
Yeah, that felt quite weird, didn't it? I don't know
Yeah,
why it
no.
felt more incongruous having Dave Grohl there, other, I suppose, than the fact that Dave Grohl is intimately sort of linked to another tragic rock and roll casualty, and that you'd think maybe being Kurt Cobain's bandmate would make you a bit more circumspect about like things like this.
Yeah, yeah, and I assume we'll talk about the 27 Club later on in this episode, but through and through, it's like again history repeating itself. It's a bit of a tragic
Yeah.
tip end, but yeah.
I also think one of the sweetest and funniest bits of this film involves an award ceremony, though, because there is a bit where they're at the Grammys, and it's a year when she won very big at the Grammys, and I think it's when they're giving her the award for best single. I think it's the best single one.
Yeah, I think it's one of the two. Yeah, yeah.
Tony Bennett reads it out, and Capaldi structures this documentary very, very well. I will say that at the start of the film, you hear her interviewed, and she names her like holy trinity of influences as Dinah Washington, Sarah Vaughan, and Tony Bennett. And she's on this satellite link up while the Grammys are taking place in America with like a group of friends and family around her. And she's sort of standing in front of this camera where it's going to go live at any minute. And when Tony Bennett comes on and starts reading out her name, she just breaks character totally and goes, "Dad, it's Tony Bennett." And for a moment there, she is back to being a kid who loves music again, at a point where her life is spiraling out of control. And it's wonderful to see that switch get flicked on in her eyes again.
Yeah, yeah, it's a completely wonderful sequence. There's another wonderful sequence later on, which is my favorite bit in the whole film, where she actually does get to meet Tony Bennett.
Yeah.
In that recording studio. And that whole sequence of her wanting to, bless her heart, bless Amy Winehouse's heart, of wanting to get that song just right.
Yeah.
And obviously being so nervous whilst doing it. And this was, I think that was done like a few months before she died. It was like mad. Yeah.
Can't remember exactly when, but it was definitely like among the last things that she did. Yeah.
And it is just a lovely, lovely sequence because you just get a really overriding sense of wanting to do this song justice, and how Tony Bennett describes as, you know, the best artists are the ones who are nervous before they step up to the microphone.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's an element of truth to that when looking at it through the context of this film. Yeah.
I think the Tony Bennett sequence is one of the ones where you get a sense of what she could have been if she'd lived and cleaned up, because a lot of artists who have drug problems and recover from them, I suppose Bowie's the ultimate example of this, do develop this incredible perfectionism and this kind of almost nervous desire to do the best job possible, partly because the obsessive, addictive part of their personality has to go somewhere.
And, you know, there's countless examples like this. I mean, think Iggy Pop or Alice Cooper, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, especially Alice Cooper. He had an issue with alcohol for years, like a really heavy one. And obviously, he fully recovered, got his act cleaned up together, and obviously, he's like one of the more beloved shock rock icons out there. So, especially in the rock and roll world. So,
yeah,
you do get those stories. Yeah. And it does make you wonder what. And I try hard not to think this because obviously, given the circumstances of Winehouse's passing, it's very hard of what she would have become had she had that not had happened.
Yeah.
Basically, it's very hard to think that because it is just incredibly depressing. You know?
It is, yeah. And I think one of the great unsung heroes of Amy Winehouse's story, who is interviewed at gratifying length here, is Salam Remy, who I think I'm right in saying is the only person who has production credits on Frank and Back to Black.
I think Yeah, I think you're right there. I think you are. Yeah.
I can't remember if Mark Ronson does or doesn't, but definitely Salam Raimi does. And I remember Salam Raimi after her death said something which I thought really made me love the guy. Sadly, it isn't in this film, but he said that as soon as she died, he got all of the unreleased recordings that they'd made together and just destroyed them, like smashed them into bits, broke the hard drive and everything. He said, she was a perfectionist. She would have hated the idea of anyone listening to these recordings if she was alive. So I think absolutely no reason why they should listen to them when she's dead.
Yeah, that's a completely telling thing of the character, because I think shortly after her death there was a compilation released of all like
Lioness, yeah.
Lioness, yeah, that was the one. And like a lot of posthumous compilations, I'm sure, for the fans it would help, obviously, of like the album that could have been, but at the same time, all it is mostly just B takes or B sides.
Yeah. And I listened to Lioness once, and there's some diverting stuff in it, but all it did was hammer home to me the fact that there was no third album, and she would have had to have go a long, long way before there would be anything resembling a third album, that it just wasn't there.
Yeah.
So yeah, the 27 Club you mentioned, this is a weird piece of rock and roll mythology that rock stars who die young will traditionally die around the age of 27. And it's known that Kurt Cobain had a sort of fascination with this idea. And who else was there in it? There's Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin.
So if I remember correctly, the big four is Brian Jones, who was the guitarist for the Rolling Stones. I think it's Brian Jones.
Yeah.
Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, as you said, Janis Joplin, as you said, Jim Morrison.
Oh, yeah.
Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse. Those are the big six that come out in my mind. And obviously, there's been a lot more artists who have died at the age of 27 as well. More notably, even like as recently as Anton Yelchin as well.
Oh, yeah.
He died at 27 as well. So and I'm just going to come out and say this now. I honestly don't believe in the idea that these deaths are linked. Honestly, all I think is that it's just pure coincidental and preposterous to think that way.
Like, even with someone like Kurt Cobain, who died at his own hand, I genuinely do not think there was any part of him that was thinking, next year I'll be 28, better get a move on. It's obviously horse shit.
Yeah, I honestly don't think it's a fair judgment at all. It's, I mean, in a way, I remember, like, at the time for Winehouse's passing, I remember, like, looking at the YouTube comment section of the reaction of Removed, and obviously, never look at YouTube comment sections. That's the that's the homegrown place of fascism. It's awful. I hate it. But anyway, there was one horrible comment in particular that was just like, "Oh, Jimi Hendrix died like a complete god of a man, and Amy Winehouse and Kurt Cobain died like wimps. They don't deserve. That's just attention seekers." Then you just come and think, Jimi Hendrix had, if I remember correctly, he was exhausted mentally from a touring schedule that obviously was really bad on his physical and mental health. Plus, he died in a similar fashion to Winehouse. He had an alcohol problem and problems with drugs as well.
Well, yeah, so no disrespect to Hendrix, but I don't remember any heroes of Greek mythological sagas choking on their own vomit.
It's just, you just immediately think, you're an idiot.
But it is sort of, a more sanguine reason for why this happens is that most people find that their relationship with alcohol and drugs changes a bit once you get around 30 years old. Most people find the hangovers last longer. Most people find that they can't drink as much as they used to. And for most people, that is just a very banal change in their life. It just means, a bit of a worse headache every now and then. But if you have a serious drug or alcohol problem, that's probably going to take a more extreme toll on your body. And so it's no surprise, I guess, that people who treat their body as though they're indestructible when they're in their teens and early 20s suddenly have serious health problems up to and including dying as they get into their late 20s.
Yeah. But no, like I said, I mean, it's just a matter of questioning whether or not, because I think it's a subject that's talked ad infinitum at the 27 Club when it comes to popular music, and I just think it should die, to be honest.
Yeah,
I don't think it's worth.
It's too old, though, isn't it? The 27 Club mythology must be about 50 years old now, so we had a chance to kill it around its 27th anniversary, but it's still staggering on.
Yeah, it's still staggering on, amazingly enough, and you just think, why do we have this in the first place?
Yes.
Like, why?
Just on the subject of celebrity deaths, because I know it's become this huge topic of conversation over the last 5 years, because in 2016, famously, every celebrity you ever loved died in the same year. One of the things about Amy Winehouse, it wasn't the first celebrity death that cut me up. I think Elliott Smith was the first celebrity death that really took its toll on me. The thing is, one of the other people who was 27 in 2011 was me. So it was quite an odd experience that I was watching someone my own age die. I had never really properly understood the tragedy of it, because when I was a teenager and I was reading about rock and roll, somebody like Kurt Cobain or Jimi Hendrix or Janis Joplin seemed impossibly old, like 27. What does it even mean to be 27? And now someone who was born the same year as me was dying.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a real heartache to that as well. And there's a real sense of, because when you think of the 27 Club in that context, you think of like, oh God, 27 feels so old, and this is normally coming from a mind of a teenager.
Yeah.
But now, as you say, I'm 25. I turn 27 in 2 years' time. So you just think, well, hang on, it's not that far ahead in the future anyway, when you really think about it.
You've got 2 years to develop that heroin habit. It's going to be tough, but I believe you can do it.
Oh, yes. But anyway, no, I mean, back to Amy, I think, like I said, I completely agree. I think it is a tremendous documentary. And the fact that, Asif Kapadia went through cross-referencing everything. He explains in the interviews that he's described that, with every fact that he got, he had to cross-reference it with at least 2 other additional people.
Yeah.
Obviously to make sure he got it right. If one of those facts didn't have at least 2 additional people, that's it. It wasn't going in the finished film. So it's nice to see that dedication. It sounds like an agonizing process considering the amount of facts and information that is in this, but it's well worth the while because it just gives like a very authentic feeling to it.
And not just the number of facts, but I imagine when you were dealing with a story like this, talking to different people about Amy Winehouse must be like Rashomon. He manages to keep it down to a really tight, manageable level of contributors. The people who were talking about being friends with her at the start of the film are still talking about her at the end of the film. But I can imagine there were a lot of people around her who there's that bit, isn't it, where she gets new management and her friends try and stage an intervention and it doesn't take. And her manager says something like, well, a lot of professional people have drug habits and they manage it. A lot of doctors and lawyers and judges and people like that have it. And you think, yeah, that's not quite the point, is it?
Yeah. I mean, there's that bit towards the end, the famous Belgrade concert, which was her last concert, where this is where it spirals completely out of control. And she refuses to sing. She obviously is off her mind on alcohol and drugs.
Yeah.
And she clearly just doesn't want to do the concert and doesn't want to go ahead with the tour. So, and everyone just says, yeah, it's basically that final gig that she did in Belgrade in Serbia was an unmitigated disaster waiting to happen. But there's this just really funny bit at the end where I think it's Nikki who says this, the manager,
Mm.
and he says that Amy told him after that after that show was a disaster. Amy said to him like, "Yeah, the tour got cancelled, but at least I can go to Nikki's wedding."
Yes, yeah.
And then it was just like that little bit, that little golden nugget of an interview is so funny. It's tragic in the same sense, but it's also a bit funny. So it's nice to see some humor in the story as well.
Nikki is pretty charming, I think. One of the things that I had forgotten or that I didn't pick up when I first watched this film is that Nikki was not much older than her. I mean, he talks about a few of the people around her at the start, like Nick Shymansky and Tyler James, who's I think has just written a book about his friendship with Amy Winehouse.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, they were like very, very junior people in the record industry at the time, and they were being handed Amy Winehouse as their first major management project, which, I mean, Jesus Christ, talk about a baptism of fire. But yeah, it is incredible to me when you see that early footage of that Nick shot of Amy in the back of a cab when she's going to record Frank, and you don't see him. I always pictured some older, like, music industry guy who'd been around the blocks a bit, and he was 19. I mean, it's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. Extraordinary. I think, like, for a film to get me this, like, interested and invested into a subject that I was not expecting to be interested and invested in at all.
Yeah.
Capaldi has done a really bang-up job here. I think this is definitely an impressive work that really deserves to be talked about and deserves to be touched because it's fascinating as well.
Yeah.
Godly fascinating of how that pop star, rock star persona is of a dying breed, but at the same time, those who can't handle it, who wants to be shut away from it, will do so in all their power. And that comes at a cost, unfortunately. So
yeah, it's strange, isn't it? And I think a lot of people did see her as being in the sort of tragic rock star mold, like you say, 27 Club, which is strange because almost all of her influences are jazz-based. I remember distinctly when Frank came out, there was kind of a wave of easy listening type singers like Norah Jones and like Dido. That moment, right? You know what I'm talking about.
yeah, I know exactly what moment.
There is a bit, listeners, in the film where Amy is being interviewed and her music is compared to Dido, and her facial expressions are just murderous. They're incredible. But a lot of people did compare her to artists like Norah Jones and Dido at the start, because I think the British music press, when it existed, and increasingly it doesn't, were always really shit at dealing with and writing about and understanding music that wasn't either rock or techno. Anything outside of that, like, I remember buying NME every week back in the 90s, and I read almost nothing about hip hop. And you look back at the 90s and you think, how do you write about music in that decade and not write about hip hop? But every week they reliably managed it.
Oh, that story just reminds me of I think this is completely going off topic, but in I think it's the Galaxy Quest documentary about Alan Rickman. There's a bit in it where one of the actors said he met Alan Rickman, and Alan Rickman said to them, "Yeah, I just recently got turned down a role." And the friend says, "Okay, but who did they give the role to?" And then he just goes in the most venomous tone of voice, "Bill Nye," and then just ends it there. And you just immediately think, oh, that moment that you've just described remind me of that, and that is funny as hell.
That's a great moment. I do love her snark. I mean, that Grammys bit also has, and we're back to the Britney Spears thing again, it also has the bit where they're reading out the nominees, and one of them is What Goes Around Comes Around by Justin Timberlake. And she just says, his song's called What Goes Around Comes Around. And then she just pulls this very telling look, like the absolute disdain she has in her eyes at that moment is so great.
She's such a character.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, that's not your typical manufactured pop star. That's someone of real class and character. And you've got to respect Winehouse for that. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to leave off, really. I think that's a pretty good point to end on.
I just want to quickly add before we end this episode. I mean, I did watch, obviously, a lot of Asif Kapadia interviews, but I implore you, watch his Criterion Closet video as well.
Oh?
It's fucking hilarious.
Okay.
Because I love those videos because you get like people like him and Barry Jenkins who are just like completely, you would think they would go for the high glamour stuff and go for all the polished stuff. No, they're just as greedy as the rest. They just ransack the place. And there's a bit where Asif Kapadia picks up a copy of Salo, says, "Warning, may contain taboo content." He reads out the sticker aloud, and then it jump cuts, and then he just goes, "Just because," and then puts it in the Criterion bag.
I do like that. May contain taboo content. I think you would have to live in a pretty liberal household for Salo not to register as taboo content.
But no, it's fantastic. But no, Asif Kapadia, he's definitely made a great documentary. He's also one of these people who I can listen to for days on end as well.
Yeah, he's a really interesting interviewee, isn't he? I remember hearing a bit from him back when in the 2012 Olympics, the government funded 4 shorts from different British directors that were meant to sum up their vision of Britain. And Kapadia did one, Lynn Ramsey did a great one. And then the government thought, that's such a good result, we'll never fund arts again. But yeah, I remember hearing him interviewed a lot then about what he was doing, and he was a really interesting guy.
Yeah. I hope he doesn't make like another documentary about the more to add to his trilogy. I hope he does something different after this.
Yeah, I agree.
I really want to see him flex his muscles after this. So whether that be another documentary of a different mold or even a fiction film, as long as it's like something that can be distinguished from his filmography.
Yeah, and also I think a lot of people have moved in on his turf, again, watching a lot of the coverage of the Britney Spears thing or watching that Michael Jackson documentary that came out a bit back. I did get a feeling that everyone who's doing these things has watched Amy quite a lot, haven't they? But yeah. He is often talked, I will say this, he has often talked about expanding the short film he did about London for the 2012 Olympics project into a feature, and I think that could be really interesting.
Yeah. But I'm excited, nonetheless. Very excited.
Yeah. So I think that wraps it up. I think that's your lot from Pop Screen for this week. Don't forget that if you subscribe to our Patreon, you can get a monthly bonus episode as well as access to our other movie podcast, Director's Lottery, which Aidan is sometimes on as well. But until then, that's been your lot from Pop Screen. I've been Graham.
And I've been Aidan.
See you next week.